This is Duffy's Coal Yard from Fine Scale Miniatures. It was released in 1993 and is one of 800 produced. The original price was $185. It commonly shows up on eBay in the $300 range. The kit consists of 4 buildings. There is the main big building, which they call the grain house. There is the lumber shed. There is a small office building and an even smaller building that is the scale house. There is also a trestle. This is one of the more interesting kits from Fine Scale Miniatures. I think the trestle adds a lot of character. The kit is designed to be built with the trestle as a dead end, but I'm going to build it so that you can run trains all the way across and continue across the other side. This kit does actually exist on the Franklin and South Manchester Railroad, which is the layout built by George Sellios, the founder of this company. Except it does not have the trestle, and the lumber shed and grain building are built kind of at an angle. So there's actually a lot of variability that you can use on this kit. You can do different things with it. You don't have to build it quite as designed, and it still looks pretty good. This is about my 10th kit or so from Fine Scale Miniatures, and it's about medium on the difficulty scale. It's not too bad. I have build videos for all of the other kits if you're interested. The instructions explain how to build this kit as a diorama. As usual with FSM kits, this kit includes a nice set of metal castings, and there is also a Jordan Miniatures car kit. The instructions do explain how to build this kit as a diorama, and you start out with the base, but I'm going to start out by building the building. And all of these buildings kind of start out the same. The first thing you want to do is use a pounce wheel to add some nail holes along the wood panels. And I'm using a sheet of plastic as a straight edge as I mark those. The diagrams tell you where to put the nail holes on each panel. I am using a 1/4 inch pounce wheel. You can get these at a lot of hobby supply stores or on eBay if you need to. My original plan for this build was to build it as an old and really dilapidated looking building, but I kind of backed off on that a little bit, and I didn't put as much effort into making it look old and worn as I do on some other kits. One of the tricks that you can do to make a building look a little more old and worn is to use a razor blade to try to raise up the clapboard on the siding. I have tried this in the past. I don't have a whole lot of luck with it, and it's pretty tedious, but I did try it in some locations on this building. These FSM kits and a lot of the older Craftsman kits typically have a lot of scratch building. Here I'm building the loading dock, and they give you the wood for this and a diagram, and you just glue the wood on over the diagram. It's not particularly difficult. It is a little bit tedious. You might find that you want to put parchment paper between the wood and the diagram so that you don't glue the sticks to the diagram. If you do that, then just use a razor blade to separate them. It's not too bad. This kit includes plenty of lumber for the scratch building, and many of the boards are pre-cut to length, so that's convenient. This is the base for Duffy's Coal Yard, and I had to actually build the base into the layout. I could not build the building onto the base kind of as a diorama and then incorporate it into the layout. One of the reasons is because this plywood is under a little bit of tension because it's sloping, and I thought if I tried to add it to the layout after having built the buildings and the trestle on it, I might damage something as the plywood flexes. So that's the main consideration. The other consideration was just making sure that everything fits. Also, you'll note that there's a little bit of a slope here because this track is going to come up a hill and reconnect at a higher elevation. So the gradient here is about 0.63%. Not only that, the track is not really parallel to the edge of the base. It's a little bit farther this distance than this distance, so there's a little bit of an angle there that was not accounted for, and there is a cutout here that doesn't quite match the way the diorama was built as part of the kit instructions. And it kind of sticks out the edge over here a little bit. For this track in the background, I decided that I really want to do as much scenery on the track area as possible before I put the buildings in. So I've started laying out the skull to mold around the track. And I'm going to start doing the ballasting. And the main reason for that is to make sure I don't damage any of the buildings as I'm doing the scenery for the track. So I was going to do that before I put the buildings in. The other reason is this elevation. So there's a little bit of an elevation change here, up to about an inch, maybe here. It's lower here than it is here. So this is a steeper gradient than this gradient. And I think I'm going to put a retaining wall in here. And that should give me just enough room to fit the diorama in. There's a little road that goes along here behind the buildings. So I think I can fit everything in. So I thought a retaining wall would be a good way to hide this elevation difference and would look pretty good. So I've got to do the scenery and the retaining wall and get this ready for all the buildings and the trestles, and then I can get this stuff in. So for some perspective on where we are, there's the Central Valley Bridge, and we're going to come across here, and this is where we start going up gradient. And back at this point is the switch, the turnout that brings us over. So we're going to follow the track along there. And then this track has separated from this track based on the turnout, but they're going to reconnect farther up the gradient. So then it's going to continue on, and there'll be some other buildings there. Something that might be worth noting is that most of the track is on cork. And here we're going to transition from cork onto plywood directly, so there'll be no more cork. One of the ways that I like to account for the height difference is to take a piece of cork and put it underneath where the two boards join. So the two boards are the same thickness of plywood, and then this is the connector board, and then this one has a piece of cork underneath it to bring it up to the correct elevation. So that's how I handle those. Here we are building the lumber shed, and you have to build 3 of these wall assemblies, and this is a little bit tricky because you want to get them as precise as possible in terms of the measurements, the heights of the cross beams and things like that, in order for it all to sort of fit together in the end. So I'm working on assembling that right now. There are 5 truss supports for the roof, and here I'm gluing those to the 3 wall sections. So what I did here is I glued the 5 truss pieces to one of the walls, and now I am coming back and adding in the other 2 walls to the truss assembly. In the instructions, he talks about building this right onto the diorama base, and I decided to just kind of build it on its own. I think it'll be easier to do painting and final assembly that way. Now with the 3 walls attached to the roof truss assemblies, I can add these diagonal support braces. This wood shed is probably the most difficult part of the whole kit. Now I add in these horizontal beams that will support the walkway. And now I add the walkway. Since the horizontal supports are not perfectly at the same level, I have to use some clothespins to make sure that the walkway gets glued to each of the supports and makes contact. These wood pieces represent the concrete supports for the trestle and the concrete retaining walls around the trestle area. And I paint those by first spraying them with an enamel primer, and then I spray them with Vallejo concrete, and now I'm applying folk art iced coffee with a sponge. I've spent a lot of time trying to come up with a really interesting and realistic way to paint concrete and stone walls. And after the folk art iced coffee, I apply a Vallejo dark brown wash, and once that dries, I dry brush on Americana burlap. These stone wall sections are not part of the kit, They're going to go behind the building on the layout as part of a retaining wall. They come from New England brownstone and are pretty high quality. They're about the best quality retaining wall pieces you can get, but they're also a bit pricey. Here we have all of the wood assemblies ready for paint. The first step is going to be to spray them with a gray primer. This is going to be an enamel primer, and one of the reasons you use an enamel is to protect the wood from any kind of damage from the water-based acrylics that we will be using later. Here are all the metal castings after I've painted them. It usually takes me about a week to go through and paint all the metal castings. I decided to make this building so old and worn that there is no longer any hint of what the original building color was. So my painting technique starts with the gray enamel primer. Then the next step is to paint on folk art barnwood, and this is a cheap acrylic paint. This paint gives pretty poor coverage. You'll see a lot of brush strokes, but that's okay because they're going to be hidden later with other weathering. George Sellios liked to use a India ink and alcohol stain mixture to weather his buildings, and a lot of other people like to do that too. I don't really like to use that. I haven't had much success with it. I prefer to just paint all over the wood, and so that's what I'm doing here. The look I am going for is like on these old barns, where there's no longer any hint of the original color of the barn. It is really just black and gray. The next step is a wash of Vallejo dark gray wash, which is practically black. Vallejo products are really high quality, but they're also pretty expensive. I've tried to find cheaper replacements for this wash, but nothing I've tried works as well. It spreads evenly and doesn't leave brush strokes. The next step is to dry brush on Vallejo silver gray. Pretty much all of the wood on this kit is going to get the same painting technique. That includes the trestle and the loading docks and all of the walls. Most of the windows in this kit are cast metal, which is one of the things I really like about FSM kits. Some of the windows in this kit are plastic, and that's okay. So now I'm gluing in the doors and windows on the main building, and I'm using super glue gel for that. Sometimes you need to make some adjustments to the holes in the wall for the doors and windows to fit. It looks like I forgot to add some trim around this doorway, so I'm taking care of that now. Ideally, I would have done this before any painting. But it's not going to be that big of a deal to come back and repaint these pieces to match the rest of the building. Now it's finally time to do assembly of the main building. You'll see that I painted the interior black so that when you look in the windows, you don't really see the other walls of the building. This is the building that he calls the office, and it's raised up off the ground, and these boards go around the base of the building to hide the area underneath the building. Conveniently, these boards are all pre-cut. Here is the current state of everything. After I put in the retaining walls, I realized that I needed to come up a little tiny bit to meet the trestle. So here are the trestle area supports. So I needed to have these razors in here to bring the concrete wall up to the bottom of those and have everything be flush. And still a little bit unflush or whatever. Then I need to glue in these walls. So over here on this end, I need to fill in here because in the diorama that George Sellios built, the trestle just ends here, but I'm continuing it on. Then this will be the ramp that comes down to the bottom. Then over here we have the line that leads into it. There's going to be some buildings here. So I have those marked out. So I'm going to start putting in gravel. I'm going to tape over the area where the building's going to be, putting gravel around those, and start filling that in. Working on the scenery and the ballast for this line. This is the Hayes & Boyd Company, another fine scale miniatures kit that I did in a previous build video from a long time ago. And I think I'm going to put it here. And in order to get it here and some other buildings, I had to extend this out. So I added in this piece of plywood. You can see where it goes along. There's the seam. And back here, I tried to fill in the gap with some mud texture. There were some knots in the wood, in the plywood. So I filled those in with some mud texture, and I'll probably make those into puddles or something like that. But this will all be kind of a gravel area with some buildings. So should be pretty cool. Line coming under and through the Hayes & Boyd factory, and then across the trestle, and then on to some other buildings. Here I'm using AK Interactive's muddy ground texture to fill in any gaps between the retaining wall and the layout base. My vision is that the coal area is not really in use anymore, so some grass has grown up around it, and so I'm applying that with some static grass. And now I'm using some scenic cement to hold the static grass in place. Here is where I need to deviate from the instructions a little bit. The trestle has long ties to support the walkway. Since I'm using flex track, I need to remove those matching ties so that the flex track will sit flush on the trestle. I'm marking out the ties I'm going to remove. I'm using Micro Engineering Code 83 flex track, and so here I am cutting out the ties that I have marked for removal. I think the instructions for the kit assume that you're going to use hand laid track for the trestle. That's not really something I want to get involved with yet, so I'm very happy just using flex track. It's time to add some grass and gravel under the trestle area. For the gravel, I'm using Woodland Scenics gravel, which is basically fine sand. I start by painting on some diluted Mod Podge. That's matte Mod Podge, about 50% Mod Podge and 50% water. And then I sprinkle on the gravel and the grass texture. Then I spray everything down with some wet water, which is water with a little bit of dish detergent. And then I spray on some scenic cement. Scenic cement's kind of expensive, so I use it kind of sparingly. I like to glue everything with Mod Podge first and just come back and kind of spray this over everything afterwards. Now we're on to the roof of the main building. The roof is supposed to be a shingled roof covered mostly with corrugated metal, but with leaving some shingle exposed. I've applied shingle to the roof where it's going to be exposed, and now I'm attaching the cardboard to the building. Sometimes you have to use a razor blade to trim up the wall edges to get the roof to sit flush on the walls. Now it's on to the metal roofing. So it gives you these sheets of corrugated metal and this template for the correct sizes. So you attach the corrugated metal to the template and then cut it to the correct width. I use a razor blade for that. In the process of cutting all of the sheet metal, I used about 3 or 4 razor blades. You can go through about 1 razor blade per piece of sheet metal. Dealing with all these roofing pieces is pretty tedious, but the next step is to paint them. So what I do is I put some masking tape with the sticky side up on a piece of cardboard, and then I attach all the roofing pieces to the masking tape. I've spent a lot of time looking at rusted old corrugated roofing in my area, and one thing that I've kind of noticed is you have a lot of panels that are kind of a solid rust color, and then you have other panels that are sort of gray and just a little bit of rust, and I think they're replacement panels. So I'm going to try and replicate that kind of look on this building. I sprayed most of the pieces with brown camouflage spray paint, but some of them I sprayed with gray primer to leave them as a gray color. And now I'm applying some rust colors using a sponge. One of the most tedious parts of any build is putting in the rafter tails. I look at the Franklin and South Manchester Railroad layout and I just think about all the rafter tails poor old George had to put on that layout. So I saved you having to watch that in the video. But now that I've done it, I have to come back and paint the ends in gray, and then I'm going to dip them with a little bit of a black wash to make them match the rest of the building. Now it's time to attach the corrugated sheet metal pieces to the roof, and I do that using super glue gel. When you pull the sheet metal pieces off of the masking tape, it's pretty difficult to not bend them and also not to scrape off some paint. So we'll have to come back and do some touch-ups later. Now I get to put together the different parts of the main building. I'm trying to get some idea of how things are going to fit together. So it's basically going to look like this. This is the roof for the lumber shed and it's covered with tar paper. So it goes on like that, and I can't decide yet whether I want to keep this roof or maybe build a more dilapidated one out of just scrap wood. Here is the pass-through area, which is something like this. That's not going to stay up. And then these pieces go on the sides. And I have to make sure that that has enough clearance for some high box cars to go through. It won't fit double stacks, of course, but that's okay. For the track going across the trestle, I tried cutting out some of the ties, and I decided that it doesn't really work very well because they become loose and they slide around on one side because only one side of the ties is fixed to the rail. So I think what I might do is just board this over, so there's board running down the middle, almost like this is abandoned and not really used anymore, so they just boarded over the holes so that people don't fall through. I think it'll look kind of interesting that way. So here is an auto parts boxcar. I'd like this to be able to fit under, but clearly there's not going to be enough room to fit under here. I think this is only going to take like old vintage height cars. So I might just scrap the whole roof thing. I guess I could put the roof without the supports. This is going to get planks put down here. But what I like to do is figure out the size of the building on the wood and then mark that out and tape over it and then spread the gravel around that area. So kind of like this area here. So you have the footprint of the building where there's no gravel, and that way the building really sits flush on the wood and you can kind of get the gravel up around it to fill in the cracks. The next step in weathering the buildings is to put on some weathering powders, typically just a brown weathering powder. And then after that, I spray it with a matte acrylic sealer or some kind of sealer. Tester's Dull Coat also works really well. Now it's time to apply some gravel. I've taped where the building is going to go, and now I'm spreading on matte Mod Podge diluted about 50% with water. And you can see there in the background the retaining wall that I built using the plaster pieces from New England brownstone. The gravel is just Woodland Scenics gravel, and I apply it using these Parmesan shakers. And then I typically like to add some color because I think it's a little bit too uniform. Typically I use an airbrush and some washes and some dry brushing, basically any paint technique that you want to use to kind of come in and color the gravel. After applying the gravel, I spray everything down with wet water, and then I spray on some Woodland Scenic cement. The Woodland Scenics gravel is pretty uniform in texture, and I like to have a little more variation. So I like to just spread this spackling compound in the gravel, and that makes it look like there's sort of some compacted dirt areas. Just kind of blend that in. And of course, then I'm going to have to paint over that. I try to focus on the road areas and where people would drive and where the tires would sort of compact the dirt and make it hard. Since the gravel is a little bit too uniform in color for my taste, and since I have to paint over the spackling anyway, I like to come back with an airbrush and spray on some various browns and even some black in some areas like around the building, just to give it a little more color variation. And I wanted to try something I hadn't done before, and that is to spray a little bit of black around the base of the buildings to kind of give the buildings a bit of a vignetted look to them. Also, since it's a former coal yard, it just needs to look a little more grimy and industrial. So to deal with the problem of the ties, I stained some pieces of wood and now I'm gluing them over the trestle. I think it'll actually look more interesting than having the holes in the ties. Now it's finally time to actually glue down the buildings. And I want to make sure that a freight car can make it past the loading dock. I'm gluing some Woodland Scenics underbrush around the base of the buildings to kind of hide some of the gaps. Here we take a look at the finished model. The lumber shed roof is actually tar paper from Builders and Scale. It's a little expensive, but I really like it better than using the paper that comes with the kit. And I did a little crossing there, and here is the Hayes and Boyd Company, which is not yet glued down onto the layout. That is a previous build video. And then another previous build video is Goldie's Electric from Barbell's Models, and that's what these two buildings are. You might notice kind of a green tint on the loading dock and on the roofs in some of the buildings. That is a slimy grime texture. AK Interactive has a product that I like, and also Ammo by MIG and Vallejo have similar products. Around this area, it's pretty common to see that kind of green, mossy lichen slime on old buildings like this. So I think it adds a nice color variation over just the black and the gray. The AK Interactive and the MIG are both enamels, whereas the Vallejo is an acrylic, and I think I kind of prefer the enamels. They're a little bit expensive, but one jar will basically last you a lifetime, so I think it's worth it. They're a little more sophisticated than just a green wash, so I really do like the effect. The posters came from previous kits. This kit didn't actually include any posters, which is a little bit unusual for FSM kits. It did include old newspapers though, which is pretty common. I added a few curtains to the main building. They were just pictures of curtains from the internet, and I just printed them out to the right scale and glued them in behind the window panes. I found the home furnishings website wayfair.com to be a really good source of pictures of curtains. If you're still watching, thanks for hanging in until the end. I hope you enjoyed the video, or at least found it helpful. I do expect I will be doing more builds of fine scale miniatures kits in the future, as well as some other kits from other manufacturers that are also out of production.